네, 안녕하세요. 오늘 사회를 맡은
Good morning,
손열입니다.
everyone. My name is Son Yeol. I'm the moderator for today.
2021 Korea Global Forum for Peace. I am a moderator today, Son Yeol, East Asia Institute and Yonsei University. Because this program, this panel is being translated from this point on, I will speak in Korean. For English speakers, please turn to the English in your web. Okay. 그러면 지금부터 한국말로 제가 하겠습니다.
Thank you very much. From now on, I'm going to speak in Korean. Once again, my greetings to you. My name is Son Yeol from EAI, East Asia Institute. So, my panel today has been organized by EAI, East Asia Institute. And the title for this panel is the Korean Peninsula and the US-China strategic competition. And the US-China relationship is the most important and focal point of the world arena. So we have to talk about the present and future of the Korean Peninsula in terms of the peace and prosperity. Therefore, the relationship between the US and China will be very important to factor into the Korean Peninsula's security. Having said that, we have to talk about the relations of the US and China from a very long-term perspective, and it is necessary for us to have the in-depth analysis to also talk about the future of the Korean Peninsula in parallel, and that is the essence and the target of our panel today. So when we talk about the relations between US and China, we have our experts, including Professor Andrew Scoble, as well as many other important scholars, especially from Japan. So we will also be talking about the future of the US-China strategic future, and also we will have the 2050 grand strategy of China as well. So these kinds of very long-term perspective in terms of researches are on the horizon. Having said that, we have to talk about the future and evolution of the US-China relations. In this regard, we also have to look into the possible future of the Korean Peninsula. So we have to ask ourselves these questions naturally. Therefore, the panel discussion for the session 1-3 is about the US-China relationship. We will be talking into the short-term, medium-term, and long-term perspective. So in this regard, we'll be also talking about what would happen in the Korean Peninsula. We will be also talking about the future of the North Korea as well as that of South Korea. So we will be also talking about the relations of the North and South Korea in the future. So our goal today is to talk about these things, as I mentioned. So the panels from the East Asia Institute include 4 prominent scholars from many countries like the US, China, Japan, and Korea. Before starting, I'd like to give you the introduction of these precious panelists. We will have Mr. Andrew Scoble. Professor Scoble is currently at the United States Institute of Peace as Distinguished Fellow for China. He is also not only an expert in the Korean Peninsula, but also in other Asian countries, and the relationship with the U.S., including the Taiwan and also Southeast Asia. He is also a prominent scholar on the security policies. He has made careers of these areas. From the Land Corporation last year, he was also the China Strategy 2050 reporting out for the future of the China and the U.S. relations. So he was involved in this very grand project. His list is actually endless, but I have to stop here. And also, secondly, we have Professor Li Ting from China. Professor Li is at Peking University at the moment as an associate professor on the Korean studies. She's also was a researcher at ASEAN Institute, and also she was also visiting scholar for the Korea University and also North Korean studies at the Yonsei University as well. She's a really renowned to the Korean areas. So he meet modern history, and the pre-modern history of Korea has been her studies. MS was given to her in Peking University, and then she went to the US for achieving doctorate degree courses on the history and in Chicago University. Now, the third panelist today is Professor Kimiya Tadashi from the University of Tokyo. Is a professor at the Literary Arts. So he's professor of the relations of the Korea and Japan. At the University of Tokyo is a dean of the Korean studies, and also he is a professor of the information studies, and also he was a professor of visiting at Harvard University Yenching Institute, and also he was the member of the Asian Network and as a fellow researcher at Asahi Shimbun. So he's a really renowned scholar for the Korean studies. With his fame, he has been continuing his scholastic researches as well. Last but not least, we have our panelist representing Korea. Is Professor Park Won-gun of Ewha Women's University. He's now at the Ewha University for the Department of North Korean Studies. He was previously a professor of international studies at Handong Global University. He is also a scholar for the North Korean affairs and the relations with the U.S. in terms of the military side. So he's a very representative scholar of the Republic of Korea. Now, I have given you the four panelists today. So this has been my introduction, and also I'd like to start right away the presentations and the discussions among the four panelists. I'm going to give you my agenda today, so I'll give 15 minutes to each presenter. So the presentation will be confined to 15 minutes, after which we are going to have general discussion with all the panelists. So I'll be the moderator for the general discussion after hearing all the presentations by the four panelists. So we'll go by with Professor Andrew Scoble first, and then he will be followed by Professor Lee Ting-Ti, and then third, Kimiya Tadashi, and then the last one will be Professor Park Won-gun. Now, without further ado, I'd like to now give the floor to Professor Scoble.
Glover, can you please start your presentation or your comment?
Sorry, should I go ahead and give my presentation?
Yes, please do.
Okay, sorry. I wasn't getting a translation. My Korean is very bad. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Son, for the kind introduction. A great pleasure to participate in the forum. I wish I could be there in person, but under the circumstances, virtual participation will have to suffice. It's also a privilege to be part of such a distinguished panel of scholars. In the next few minutes, I want to address 4 points. First, the nature and trajectory of U.S.-China relations. Second, how U.S.-China relations dynamics are likely to manifest themselves in the international system. And third, how this U.S.-China relations are likely to play out regionally, and fourthly, what all this might mean for the Republic of Korea. By the way, I should add that what I'm about to say represents only my own views, not the views of the U.S. Institute of Peace or anyone else. So, to the first point, What is the most accurate way to describe the current relationship between the United States and China? And where is the relationship headed? I submit that in 2021, the relationship is best characterized as a full-blown great power rivalry. A rivalry is an antagonistic relationship of long-term hostility and competition manifest in multiple disputes, continuing disagreements, and the threat of the use of force. What great power rivalry or competition means in international relations beyond heightened tensions and increased potential for conflict is somewhat unclear. But what is clear is that the mantra of great power competition is foremost in the minds of elites, both in Washington and Beijing. Although I should add that Chinese leaders and analysts are much more reluctant to say so publicly than their US counterparts. While the future of US-China relations are shrouded in, with uncertainty, the possibility of near-term thaw seems most unlikely. Thus, the road ahead is likely to be bumpy and turbulent. Second, what will extended strategic competition between the US and China mean at the level of the international system? Persistent rivalry does not mean that the two states are destined for war, nor does it preclude the possibility of cooperation between Washington and Beijing. But the absence of actual military conflict will not necessarily translate into a stable and peaceful global environment. Indeed, competition will be global, since both the United States and China are present and active around the world. Moreover, this competition will be conducted across multiple hard and soft power domains, not just in the military sphere, but also in economics, technology, as well as in the realms of diplomacy, information, and culture. Third point, how is US-China competition likely to play out in the Western Pacific and Northeast Asia? In recent years, Chinese interlocutors have periodically, half-jokingly told their US counterparts that the two countries should draw a north-south dividing line in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Everything to the east of the line would be considered to be in a US sphere of influence, while everything to the west of that line should be considered to be part of a Chinese sphere of influence. Of course, this is not a serious proposal. Nevertheless, the jest does provide some insight into Chinese thinking. The tongue-in-cheek proposal, though, overlooks two important details. First, the real friction of US-China rivalry is not spread evenly across the entire Pacific Ocean. Rather, the confrontations overwhelmingly occur in the Western Pacific, with the greatest flashpoints concentrated within the so-called near seas, including what the Republic of Korea calls the East Sea and the West Sea. Second, the pseudo-proposal I'm mentioning also overlooks the reality that this is not the kind of binding geopolitical deal that can be struck by Washington and Beijing. Other countries get a vote. Indeed, the United States would never presume to speak for the Republic of Korea or any other American ally or the Republic of Korea. Well, extended US-China rivalry will, in a nutshell, make life complicated for Korea as it seeks to thrive in a challenging neighborhood. Korea is caught between its most important trading partner and its most important security partner. Yet Korea should not have to choose sides. Rather, Seoul can push back against coercion and stand up to bullying. One thing that Beijing respects is strength and resolve, and the United States will stand by its treaty ally. If the Republic of Korea vigorously protects its own national interests, stays true to its ideals and security commitments, then Seoul will not face a future without true friends. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Scobell. 감사합니다, 스코벨 교수님.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you very much for the presentation by Dr. Scobell. And I learned that we have precious lessons, except for the part that was missing because of the technological glitches. We will be talking about this by asking him again what he was trying to say. Overall, that was a great introduction, as I believe, for our panel today. Dr. Scobell has been giving us the big overview on the relations between China and the U.S. Currently, the relationship is about the full-blown rivalry on a global scale, which seems to be a little bit pessimistic for us. Secondly, what he emphasized is that the relationship between the U.S. and China is fundamentally based on the competition at the global level, not just at the regional level. Also, it has very multifaceted phases, including the military and economy. So the multifaceted rivalry is on the rise between the two countries. Thirdly, what he was trying to say is that the rivalry between the two superpowers is, from the perspective of the U.S., the West Pacific area has been showing some perspectives, and he has given us the image of that. And also, last but not least, what stance should be taken by the Korean Peninsula and the Republic of Korea? Thank you very much for that. Now, moving on, we'd like to now ask Professor Lee Ting-ting from Peking University, 15 minutes, please. Professor Lee.
네, 감사합니다. 베이징다 리팅팅이라고 합니다. I am Lee Ting-ting from Beijing University. First and foremost, thank you very much for inviting me to this important forum, and I would like to thank the organizer as well as the moderator, Professor Sonia. I am also very delighted to see your familiar faces as well as be part of this distinguished panels, including the Professor Andrew Scobell. Thank you very much. What I am asked to present today is the China's policy on the Korean Peninsula and the strategic competition between the U.S. and China. So the key question that I would like to talk about is whether there are any changes in China's policy toward the Korean Peninsula, and what kind of roles can China play in the Korean Peninsula. So these will be the two key points that I will discuss. And I actually listened to the Professor Scobell's presentation, and I actually wanted to focus more on denuclearization. But while listening to the Professor Scobell's presentation, I actually wanted to make a few more comments. So my presentation also consists of the 4 parts. The first one is the rivalry between the U.S. and China, and the second one is the China's policy in the Korean Peninsula. And then I'm going to talk about the stalemate of the China-U.S. negotiation. And then the fourth one is what kind of roles should China play? So as mentioned and highlighted by the Professor Scobell, I would like to mention that this is just my personal opinion, and this does not reflect the institute that I belong to. Compared with the other panelists, I think that I'm not really as experienced as them. I will just briefly go over the strategic competition between China and the U.S., and the Professor Scobell gave us a wonderful summary. And he mentioned that while the U.S. publicly talks about the relationship with China, but the China is reluctant to make any kind of public comment. And I agree with this. So from the Donald Trump administration to today's President Biden, you can see that the rivalry, that's the basic for the U.S. policy to China. And they actually define China as the greatest competitor. And the Professor Scoble defined the two countries' relationship as great power rivalry. And I believe that I agree with this. So not just the military sectors, but also in the soft powers, technologies, and also in other future areas, you can see that we will continue to see full-blown competition between China and the U.S. Whereas to China, it's somehow reluctant, and they were somehow forced to enter into this competition landscape. China, I don't think that it has any kind of intention or will to rage against the U.S. Rather, what they wanted was to have the peaceful prosperity with the Korean Peninsula and also other neighboring countries. And China also made efforts to manage the relationship with the U.S. So the Chinese foreign diplomatic minister came up with the 3 lists for the management of the relations with the U.S. And also in his press conference, he talked about the competition based on goodwill. In other words, fair and transparent competition. That was what China suggested to the U.S. Of course, this is just an official proposal, so this may not be directly translated into the actual reality, but a lot of Chinese scholars and Chinese politicians they are trying to ease the current conflict with the U.S. And also in the current U.S.-China relationship, I believe that now we are in the time of both the hyperactiveness and stability. In other words, the competition or rivalry does not mean that the two countries will be engaged in military warfare or any kind of the exchanges and cooperation will be discontinued. Rather, yes, when it comes to diplomatic rhetoric, the two countries tend to be engaged in a very severe rivalry. But when it comes to economy, you can see that the two countries' trade volume actually increased last year. And also when it comes to human exchanges, a lot of Chinese students study overseas, especially including the U.S. And human exchanges, I think they are also showing signs of recovery. And also both China and the United States, they admit the need for cooperation, especially for various kind of cross-border issues such as climate change, COVID-19, and also denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula. Both countries multiple times emphasized the need for cooperation. And in that sense, China's policy toward the South Korea, basically I think its position is to maintain the existing policy. Although we have some different and changing dynamics. In other words, its goal is to achieve the denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula, as well as peace and stability in the region, and pursue joint development. That's the basic stance of China's policy. And also, parallel pursuit of denuclearization and peace regime, that's its priority goal. And also in resolving the issues on the Korean Peninsula, China has the principle that the Pyongyang and Seoul should be in the driver's seat. And for the unification, again, the North and South Korea should take initiatives. And also for its policies to the North Korea, it has made efforts to improve the relationship, and especially next year, it has a special anniversary, and I understand that it makes a lot of efforts to work with the South Korean government. I understand that the South Korea is under a lot of pressure amid the current rivalry between the two major powers, and Korea should not take side, of course. Korea should exercise its autonomy and pursue its national interest. And as for the relation with North Korea, recently, especially, the communications and diplomatic exchanges with North Korea between China and North Korea are actually increasing in numbers this year. So, for example, like they commemorate the anniversaries together, or they send a letter of condolences to the floods, to the other party affected by flood and natural disasters. And as I said earlier, China's goal is to achieve the denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula, regional peace and stability, and also co-prosperity and joint development. And this is something that China has maintained for a long time. And for future tasks, China has respected the South and North Korea. So rather than intervening in the situation, they have emphasized the principles. However, if need be, and also through the exchanges with the neighboring countries, I believe that China should come up with more specific policy. This is just my personal opinion. In other words, the South Korea and China, and the United States, they all talk about the phased approach for denuclearization, while the South Korea and the U.S. suggested several practical measures to achieve that. China has only reiterated the importance of principle, but I believe that now is the time for China to come up with actual and more specific measures. And if there is a need for the multilateral talks, then I think China should also take more active leadership. Of course, everything should be coordinated and concerted with the neighboring countries. Currently, the China and the U.S., they are mired in the stalemate, and the negotiation has been protracted despite a lot of changes and the progress. The U.S. and North Korea, have failed to have resumed the negotiations. North Korea blamed the U.S. that they don't fulfill their promise, and also both countries complain about the opaqueness and also the denuclearization, the goal. It's stipulated differently with the score between the Korea-U.S. joint declaration and the G7 declaration. And also North Korea lash out at the joint military exercises between the U.S. and its allies. Of course, through the relationship between South and North Korea, they've made efforts to find some breakthrough. But as you are well aware, again, the South and North Korea, their relations also derailed recently. And also, there was a report recently that the Yongbyon nuclear reactor is going to be reoperated. And I believe that this will provide some catalyst to the resumption of the negotiation between North and the United States. And North Korea is actually seeking ways to resume talks with the U.S. And in that sense, what kind of role should China play? I believe that China should change their perceptions and mindsets about its role. In the past, we talked about the strategic patience, and at the time, the countries around the world to the China about for its active role, but at the time, China was emphasized only as the country that implements and participates in the sanctions against North Korea. And also there was the theory of excluding China. So I believe that there are several sectors that China can contribute to. So based on close coordinations and cooperation with the neighboring countries, I believe that China should take a more active role as a mediator, especially the multilateral talks is now growing its importance and growing needs. And therefore, based on the previous experiences, I believe that the China can play a more active role in seeking multilateral negotiations. And in this sense, in order to improve the situation on the Korean Peninsula, I believe China can have multiple roles to play. Let me summarize them into 5. Number 1, in order to pursue the parallel development of denuclearization and peaceful regime, yes, the U.S.-North Korean negotiation should be resumed, and China should be involved in creating an environment for that. And also, as for the multilateral talks, yes, we can have 3-party, 4-party, or 6-party talks. And also next year, the Beijing is going to hold the Winter Olympic Games. Maybe they can offer some venue for the multilateral negotiations involving South and North Korea as well as the U.S. Of course, further details have to be discussed, but I believe the possibility is open for that. And also regarding the cooperation and biosecurity against the COVID-19, currently, the North Korea is not included in the support program through the COVAX. So in order to provide the vaccine support to North Korea, I believe that China and South Korea and other relevant countries can step up their efforts. And also the China agrees to the South Korean government's proposal for forming the East Asian Alliance. And also for the humanitarian support for North Korea. Again, I think that China can play a more active role. So if there is any need for humanitarian support, then China can establish infrastructures to prevent the spread of the COVID in the process of providing humanitarian support. And also for climate change, again, China can have a lot to play. Both China and North Korea, they're heavily affected by floods recently. And both countries, I think they can engage in cooperation to recover and prevent the flood. And also environment-friendly development. This is something that all the countries have to pursue together. And with that, I would like to conclude my presentation. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Lee Ting-ting, for your presentation. Well-structured and very concise presentation. Thank you very much. She's a scholar studying North and South Korea in China. So I believe that she has a deep understanding in our issues, and her presentation was really informative. As for the U.S.-China relationship, as mentioned by Professor Scobell, rather, I think we could see some differences in nuances and tone. So she tends to have a more modest position than Professor Scobell. So the competition and the conflicts between the U.S. and China, yes, they exist. However, we also have a lot of room for cooperation. And when it comes to the Korean Peninsula, the U.S.-China, there are a lot of things that they can work together. So she suggested several proposals. And also she talked about the China's strategy toward North Korea. And she said that rather than just emphasizing the principle of denuclearization, she said that China should come up with more specific proposals and measures. And Also, she said that China should play a more active mediator, especially in multilateral talks. And also, she talked about what China can contribute to North Korea in terms of cooperation. Now we will move on to the third presenter.
We have invited Professor Kimiya Tadashi, professor at the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences of the University of Tokyo. Would you please start now?
Thank you
very much. As was just introduced, my name is Kimiya Tadashi. This is a really timely and meaningful event. Thank you very much for inviting me. This session is about the relations of the US and China, which is being intensifying at the moment. What kind of influence it can have on the Asian part, including Japan and also the Korean Peninsula. As a scholar representing Japan, I'd like to talk about this issue. First of all, when we have the condition that there is a structural transformation of the South Korea and Japan, we do have the different relations here. So I'd like to now talk about this bilateral relations. Next, I'd like to talk about the impact of the intensification of the US-China strategic rivalries on the North Korean nuclear problem and our policy toward North Korea. That will be followed by my analysis on the impacts of the intensification of the US-China strategic rivalries of the South Korea-Japan relations via our policy toward China or the US-China rivalries. Last but not least, I'll be talking about our preferable policy regarding the US-China strategic rivalries. First of all, let me talk about the structural transformation of the South Korea and Japan relations. I think that starting from 1990, when we have the economic relations, we have the imbalanced relationships at that time on, and then we have seen the changes over time from asymmetrical to symmetrical relationship. First of all, we do have the horizontalization in terms of power and division of labor that has been transformed into the more equal relationship, and that doesn't require further explanation because everybody knows about that. So this kind of division of the labor has been changed, so we have to acknowledge that there is a change in the relationship from both sides. The second thing is about the communalization in terms of regime value. We used to have different ideologies in the past prior to 1990. However, we are beginning to have the shared values, especially in political democracy and market economy. These shared values are spreading in each country's institutions. However, these kind of shared values, especially on the democracy, we have different interpretations between these two countries. We have to acknowledge that there have been the different interpretation of democracy by each government. Next, I'd like to talk about diversification in terms of the actors and areas. So we used to have a just relationship of these actors in here. However, we did have the changes over to the metropolitan and also the municipal government. So we used to have the central government relations only. However, we now have the more multifaceted relations at different levels of the government and the countries. So what kind of relationship has been made onto this because of these changes in the political situations? And also next, I'd like to talk about the bilateral and balanced interaction from the unilateral and unbalanced interaction in terms of concern, information, and values. You used to have a different situation when there was a very asymmetrical and unbalanced relationship because there are more goods to go to Japan rather than the other side around. So we should have the change acknowledged that we have the changes over time. So mutual concern, informative direction, and value interaction is becoming more equal in quantitative terms. So we have to say that we have some possibilities of wanting to have the give up of the multilateral relationship because of this sour relationship. Also, next I would like to also talk about the structural transformation and the relations. We used to have the symmetrical and complementary systems. So we used to have the systems that South Korean authoritarian regime could suppress its domestic opposition due to its cooperation with Japan. So this made some relations between the two countries. However, with the changes over time, we now have the new phenomena that the powers between the two countries, Japan and South Korea, are becoming more and more equal. So although this is indirect relationship and the impact, we have to understand why we have such changes, and these changes are coming from the structural changes. Then I'd like to now talk about the second issue. So what is the relationship with North Korea based on the relationship between Japan and South Korea? What kind of impact and influence we will have in the future? First of all, basically, we have to say that there is a need for the cooperation amongst these countries. The conflict between the US and China is not helpful for this region. And also, as the buffer country, I believe that China is valuing North Korea as a buffer country, as its asset. Therefore, there will not be giving up the situation. And also, U.S. is also concentrating its efforts on the confrontation with China, neglecting to a certain degree North Korea. North Korea in this situation might think that there is a need for it to have the military retaliation, and if that happens, that will be the worst scenario that we can expect. And also, when we talk about the impact of this confrontation between U.S. and China, do we think that this is the only option to go? Well, we have to think about other things as well. There might be other possibilities to have the very abnormal situations. And also, probably the U.S. might have the situation that they want to isolate North Korea from China. Having the situation, we might have a different development in the situation. So there might be the very tragic circumstances in Korea. South Korea has been benefited by the U.S. and also it has to be benefited in the future from the U.S. and China to have the stabilization of the Korean Peninsula, and there might be other cases as well. So if the new and desirable conditions are coming to us, we have to have the situation where we are able to persuade the U.S. and China at the same time. But is it really viable? Can we really have the parallel situation? So the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula should be maintained in a very peaceful manner, and that is the common interest between South Korea and Japan. There might be, however, the mutual distrust between the China and also with other countries. And also, we believe that there can be other situations, and it can be one of the best scenarios. And also, from the perspective of North Korea, they can be saying that there will be an imbalance of the situation. So all these situations will lead to the further estrangement and the bigger mutual distrust among the parties here. Therefore, it will be estranging the relations of the South Korea and Japan further. So will it really be that way? We have to have a review on the possibilities. Next, I'd like to talk about the perspectives on the confrontation between the U.S. and China by our countries. So first of all, South Korea and Japan want to avoid tremendously intensified and dangerous relations between U.S. and China. And also both South Korea and Japan want to avoid the U.S.-China joint hegemony. In order to do that, we should have the very long-term perspective of promoting mutual interests between our two countries. Having said that, in detail, we also see the divergence that is the true reality at the moment between our two countries. South Korea prefers relatively good relations between U.S. and China because of its dependence on U.S. in terms of military alliance, its dependence on China in terms of economy, and its dependence on both U.S. and China in terms of North Korean policy. So in order to that, we have to have the very good relations between the U.S. and China, and also the China as a country which has the vote on at the UN that General Assembly might want to have this North Korea by its side. So probably that will not be the worst case scenario for this situation. And also Japan prefers relatively intensified relations between US and China, taking the Japanese presence in the US strategy against China into serious consideration. So for the issues of the North Korean or the North Korean nuclear issue, the cooperation between the US and China is a must for South Korea. Therefore, South Korea want to have the situation, the intensified confrontation between the two superpowers is maintained. So we have to say that South Korea has this kind of position, and also the Japan has its own position differently, as I mentioned so far. So as I said, Japan prefers kind of intensified relations between the U.S. and China, as Obama, and the former president, emphasized the policy of the pivot to Asia. That was not enough for Japan at the moment. Therefore, Japan, with the territory of China, and also they have to have the intensified Western relations with the U.S. So Indo-Pacific has to be the playground for Japan. So it has been the point of argument of Japan. It has been successful for Japan to insist on the importance of the Indo-Pacific area. So the U.S. has been also agreeing with Japan for the importance of this area, and also the moderate and also the appropriate intervention by the U.S. is really important and necessary. So the Japan thinks that it is necessary for it to have the support from the U.S. So after the Cold War, and also the entrapment, and also the is better than the abandonment policies. However, after the Cold War, the abandonment policies have been surging instead of the previous policies. So there is a divergence between these two countries, South Korea and Japan, in these terms. So probably even distrust can happen. That is the question we have. Japan might not be able to understand why South Korea is ambiguous regarding the U.S.-China strategic rivalries, despite the fact that South Korea shares not only democracy as regime value, but also military alliance with the U.S., completely not with China. From the perspective of Japan, so Japan is afraid that South Korea might be rather neutral or even pro-China. So that is the pessimism enjoyed by the Japanese. So this is also based on the historical issues, and that has been intensifying the distrust on South Korea. Now let's talk about the perspective of South Korea. South Korea might be suspicious of Japan because Japan might prefer the intensification of the U.S.-China strategic rivalries, which South Korea makes every effort to avoid. So South Korea is afraid that Japan might be detrimental for South Korean interests. So South Korea doesn't want to use the Indo-Pacific as much as possible. So regarding the issue of the confrontation of the U.S. and China, there is a different perspective and the viewpoint by South Korea and Japan respectively. They are based on not only the historical issues between the two countries, but also the understanding about the relationship with China. In other words, even though we have historical legacies, we have to be able to cooperate together for the future issues. Therefore, the governments of South Korea and Japan have been refraining themselves from surfacing the historical issues. However, now is a different time, so the South Korea wants to have the motivation to make it an emphasis and priority with the historical issues to deal with Japan. Last but not least, I'm going to talk about our preferred policy regarding the U.S.-China strategic rivalries. Is it really a unavoidable future that we have in the future? First of all, the condition that or premise that we have to have is that these kind of relations cannot be maintained permanently. So in order to have the engagement policies and diplomacies, the relationship between South Korea and Japan should be even as much as possible. But South Korea will not be able to prevent further developments in these areas. That is not sustainable. Therefore, Japan is the same. So the confrontation between US and China might be beneficial to Japan to a certain degree. But what is important here is to a certain degree. So it will not be absolutely beneficial to Japan. So there might be some aftermath of that. So if the confrontation between the two superpowers is too much intensified, Japan will not be able to avoid or prevent the situation that will be aggravating the situations in Japan. So Japan cannot control the intensification of the US-China rivalries within the range. So the Japan is not actually possible to avoid serious damage. Japan might be seriously damaged due to the uncontrollable intensification of the US-China rivalries. So Japanese diplomacy based on such uncontrollable US-China rivalries will also be unsustainable. Of course, with these conditions here, the promising future cannot be achieved alone by either South Korea or Japan. So what is important is to have the cooperation with middle power countries in these areas so that we can have the solidification of the situations and the future promises. So looking back, as I mentioned before, the relationship between the US and China and also the alliance with the US by both countries. The South Korea and Japan, both of them are sharing their interest and also the awareness of the importance of the relationship with the US and their neighboring countries. Of course, they have to share some of the interests here in this regard. Therefore, it is necessary for both of the countries to have the restructured diplomacy policies. So in order to do that, the legacy issues like historical issues or the diplomacy issues should be overcome easily or maintained at least in order to have the further and better relations in the future. Having said that, currently the confrontation between the US and China and also the confrontation on the North Korea, we have to acknowledge that there is also not enough conditions for us to achieve those goals. And also, it has been also appearing in many of the theses and papers regarding the relations and geopolitical relations among all these countries. So what is needed is to have the government leaders, both countries, to be able to confidently maintain and manage the situations and diplomacy amongst these countries, and especially between South Korea and Japan. This has been my presentation. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Kim Mia. Within such a short time, I'm very much impressed to elaborate all these important issues. He has touched upon all these important ideas and the perceptions. First of all, the history has been changed between South Korea and Japan in terms of the relations from asymmetrical to symmetrical, less equal to more equal. And what is important here is that the relations between the US and China, which is aggravating at the moment, we have to deal with the North Korean issues. So there is a need for the cooperation between our two countries, South Korea and Japan, to deal with the North Korean issues. Therefore, as a conclusion, he said that restructured diplomacy and relationship between South Korea and Japan would be very important for joint collaboration and also the countermeasures to North Korea and also the relationship with this US and China. However, it has been a stumbling block for us to have the soured relationship between our two countries in dealing with North Korea. Also, last but not least, he mentioned that the diplomacy of South Korea, as well as that of Japan, cannot be maintained forever or permanently with the intensification of the confrontation between the US and China. So both of the countries should be working together as middle power countries. And there have been a lot of methodologies that he suggested so far. Thank you very much. Time has elapsed. So we have about 30 minutes from now on to go further. And last but not least, I'm going to now give you Korean panelist, Professor Park Won-kwon, before having our general discussion. Professor Park, please. Thank you very much for giving me such an honorable opportunity to be here today. Amid the COVID-19 situation, I was wondering if we could achieve this kind of event here. But coming here, I found that the preparation has been thorough, and also the disease control has been really wonderful here. So thank you very much for giving me this opportunity, Professor Son, and also this EAI. And also, we have the honor of having all other professors here, Professor Kimiya, Professor Scoble, and Professor Lee. Thank you very much, and very nice to see you here, although it's from the other side of the screen. I'm going to talk about the understanding and prospect of the conflicts between the US and China and what Korea should do in terms of that. Actually, whenever we have this kind of conferences, it has been like happening since 2018. So it has been like 3 or 4 years, 3 years since 2018, since we've been talking about these issues at the government level and also at the 1.5 track with the US officials as well. Even today, this is really important issue for all of us. So I believe that as a just professor from a academic, I do not want to give my disclaimer, but I have to say in the introduction that there are very similar discussions and ideas in this regard in those countries. So my presentation today is based on my own personal opinion, not representing my university either. So let's talk about the understanding and prospect of the conflicts between the US and Japan. Many people are talking about these issues. Even today, we've been hearing all the professors talking about their own perspectives. They sound a little bit different in their tone of words, but anyway, I have to tell you that this is not about the new Cold War, as mentioned by some people. Probably strategic rivalry is a more updated word, but I do not think that we are entering the new Cold War yet. So we are not seeing the decoupling between the two countries yet, and maybe it's only the partial breakaway or just reconnection at the strategic level. They are the symptoms that I see now. Of course, when we see a lot of the relationship shapes between the two countries, there is a possibility for them to be diverged further. Especially when we talk about the ideological confrontation, there are worrying voices as well. Especially in Korea, we have a lot of the worrying voices. If we have this new Cold War, Korea might be restricted further in terms of our movement. That's what the people are worried about here. So we have to say this is a friend or foe, and we have to just think of the zero-sum game. So in that case, Korea might have to opt the very worst situation. So I am very relieved that we do not see any symptoms yet about the new Cold War. However, we cannot rule out any possibility either. As mentioned by the Biden administration regarding the ideological confrontation, there have been a lot of voices coming from the officials of the administration. Especially in the past when they had the Trump administration, they almost declared the ideological warfare. And also nowadays, even they've been talking about the relationship and the confrontation between democracy and the autocratic regime. And also when they talk about the technology, that's about also technological authoritarianism coming from China. So I cannot rule out the possibility of having the new Cold War in the future. Especially when I think and also see the inside of the US politics. I believe that many of the American people at their civilian level are voicing against China, so that there is a prevalence of the idea against China. Therefore, the stance against China can be intensified in the future as well. The policies on China by Biden administration will be very important for Korea. Since we had the summit meeting in Hanoi, and we also had the joint statement, including myself, for the joint statement that was unexpected, and also unprecedented by the Korean administration. So ever since Moon Jae-in administration has been started, that was the noticeable thing that mentioned in the joint statement, that they are going to be against the proliferation of the China's power. So I have to tell you there are three types of the developments in Korea that will be very important to US as well. First of all is the getting the legitimacy based on the democratic system. So RBO, rules-based autonomous system, will be very important. So RBO will be very important. So as mentioned before, based on the voluntary consent, they want to have the more securing of the allies and friends to have their solidification, consolidation. So that's what we see from the Biden administration. And that will be the focal point of dealing with the China and the countries. So by having the better position and bigger power, they want to just intensify their positions for the security that is coming on and on. And when they have the 2+2 meeting by the Secretary Austin and Secretary State Secretary, they have in Japan, they have the mention of the force multiplier, which is about the multiplication factor of the force. This is a military terminology. So that is, they're going to have the reconnection of the forces that can have the reinforcement of the systems, having the summation of the just total of all these factors. The fact that they have been mentioning this kind of military terminology in the meetings of 2+2 in Japan is that they want to really have the better relationship against China in more intensified manner. And also, global posture review, the GPR, is also underway, especially by Biden administration. So that was February 28th this year that Biden declared this as a new plan, and it has not been disclosed yet about the final result, but it will be soon. That is about the importance of the Korea in the Indo-Pacific region. Although the GPR has not been completed, I was able to confirm some of the essential parts here. First of all, the Indo-Pacific area will become the one single theater. That is really important in its meaning. In the past, when they have the military posture or military strategy, although they just discarded it later, they will have the two major theaters, including Korea and also the Korean Peninsula. However, they're now having the Indo-Pacific as a one big single theater. It means that China's power will be further constrained with the will by the U.S., which is very clear to see. The second thing is that they're going to have the grid system for these areas. So there is intention for that. Having said that, the key allies in this area, Korea and Japan, will be very also important. Therefore, the relationship among the U.S., Korea, Japan will be very important. So trilateral relationship will be very much emphasized by the Biden administration. Also, the third one, and by the Biden administration, is the most noticeable one and the different one from the past. So systematic liberalism can be flexibly used by the Biden administration. The NSCC coordinator, Mr. Campbell, said that there is the bespoke relationship, and also the bespoke or customized approaches will be used. So even in Quad system, that idea is visible. Not formal system, but informal system will be used in order to be more flexible in terms of the approaches. So going back to the US-Korea ROC summit meeting in February 1st, I believe that there was an agreement on this kind of posture between the two countries. So in the Indo-Pacific region, which is wanted by the US, there may have been included a lot of ideas what can be done in the Indo-Pacific region against China. Probably the very detailed approaches can be made by Korea as well. Quad is not something that Korea can be freely joining. The U.S. knows about it very much. Therefore, the bespoke approaches can be used depending on the situations and circumstances of the countries like South Korea and Japan. So this is very effective because it both pursues the ideas and also the actual efficacies at the same time. So this means that everything will not be ended in a very short term. So this kind of situation will be dragging for a very long time. In this kind of situation, what can Korea do? So I've been researching on these issues in my university for a long time, so I hope you can just refer to them. I am in agreement with the result of these researches. So I believe that the result will be dependent on the relations of the U.S. and China, especially in the U.S. It was January 1st this year that was very surprising event in the U.S. There was a rampage by the protesters in the U.S. into the Capitol Hill by the citizens there. There was really a bad image for the democracy or the model of democracy of the U.S. So if they can go back to the situation before, then there's a likelihood or the possibility for the U.S. to restore the model of democracy. And also we can see the abnormal situations in China having the control over Hong Kong, denying the one country, two systems that have been committed so far. Let me go back to the Korean Peninsula situation, as mentioned by Professor Kimiya before. When we have the situation, probably have to be fully utilized. The North Korea has to fully utilize the confrontation between the U.S. and China. So North Korea, although it claims China is kind of their best friend for such a long time, I don't think that this is what they really meant, because that's the marriage by the intention. It's a marriage by strategy. So probably North Korea wants to maximize its position within all these neighboring countries. We have to deal with the North Korea in terms of what they really want. So in the Party Congress in August 1st last year, they made it very clear that they're going to have a very tough road in the future. It means that they're going to be persistent or patient for a long time. It will not be just given to the U.S. or China very easily. So especially with the U.S. So it will not be dealing with the U.S. for a small discussion. So they can be waiting. That's what they really meant. And also because of the repression of also the situations in here. So probably that's why the North Korea is bonding more closely with with China, at the moment. However, the means that we can press North Korea will be based on the military thing. So there are three things. First of all, as seen recently in the reopening of the Yongbyon, North Korea wants to show its military force and power once again. The second thing is the missile launches and the KN-2 and KN-24, which are the strategic warfare forces as proclaimed by the Kim Jong-un president, and they're going to continue with that. And also the third one is to intensify the tensions in the Korean Peninsula and also in the area. So they will be much more patient than we think. So probably they will be waiting until the end of next year. So it is regrettable to say that the strategy and tactics by North Korea so far has been the brinkmanship before having a turnaround. So as we learned from these lessons of the past, we know that there can be a tension like that, and also we have to avoid it at the same time by asking them to come to the negotiation table. However, I don't see any practical ways of doing that, so it's really regrettable. Last but not least, I would like to talk about what can be done by South Korea. Professor Scoble said that South Korea should not have any option. I'm in agreement to a certain degree with that. However, we have the zero-sum game between the U.S. and China. We are forced to have an option. We are forced to take a side in an international arena. What we have to do at this moment of time is to have a principle. We have to be based on the principle. So regrettably, we do not see those kind of very clear-cut principle in the future and also in this area of the Indo-Pacific. However, the people, especially the young people, should be able to lead the situation. And also having said that, the relationship with Japan should be better. At the moment, I don't see any better future though, but there is a need for us to be more active in restoring the relationship with Japan as well. Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Professor Park. In such a short time, he has been able to give us all the important points as well. The confrontation between the U.S. and China, and also has been summarizing very well about the North Korean stances to the U.S. and the future of the U.S.-China relations, and how can we deal with the North Korean, what they are thinking. So Professor Park has been giving us his personal opinion so far. And lastly, he also has given us suggestion for what Korea can do. Probably it should be dealt with by the next administration, especially when we talk about the diplomacy with Japan. We have about 15 minutes for our general discussion, which is not a long time. It's a very short time, actually. Now, we have 4 panelists. So I'm going to ask some questions to all these panelists. First of all, Professor Scoble and Professor Lee. They can answer my first question together. So it goes to both of them. My second question will be going to Professor Kimiya and Professor Park.
So my first question is that both China and the United States, we have representatives from China and the US in our forum. And as for the rivalry between the two countries, yes, there are aspects of the confrontation, conflict, but that will not be elevated to war, of course. Competition always go hand in hand with cooperation. And in this sense, my question is that in relation with the Korean Peninsula, the cooperation between the US and China, in other words, tackling the issues on the Korean Peninsula through cooperation between the two countries, do you think that the Korean, is there any possibility for U.S.-China cooperate each other, especially, for example, like the joint responses for denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula? In other words, is it possible to have the cooperation on the Korean Peninsula which will positively improve the cooperation between China and the U.S. in all fronts, and also the non-proliferation is critical for denuclearization. So non-proliferation and counter-proliferation, these are very important issues. And regarding these important issues, what will be the possibility for China and the U.S. engaging in cooperation? So we'll first hear from Professor Scoble and then Lee Ting-ting. I cannot give you a long time, so maybe 4 to 5 minutes. Professor Scoble, can you please start?
Sure. Thank you for the question. I think there's some good reasons for optimism that there can be cooperation between U.S. and China to prevent proliferation. But I think expecting concrete or tangible cooperation on the Korean Peninsula beyond that is really unfortunately not realistic. I think that meaningful cooperation between the U.S. and China on the Korean Peninsula beyond what I just mentioned is dependent on the overall climate in U.S.-China relations. And sadly, as I've outlined, it's one of a great power competition. And so that makes it very, not impossible, but much more challenging for cooperation between the US and China. And I think it gives North Korea more room, as I think Professor Kimiya has pointed out. So all in all, the situation is not auspicious for developments, tangible progress and cooperation between Washington and Beijing, where the Korean Peninsula is concerned. Thank you.
Thank you. 리팅팅 교수님. 네.
Professor Lee Ting-ting,
예, 질문 감사드립니다.
thank you very much. For
굉장히 좋은 지적을 해주셨는데요. 중국에서도 관련된 그런
So we also have a lot of heated debates on this issue in China. After the launch of Biden administration, regarding the cooperation between the US and China, we always talked about denuclearization, and especially the Korean Peninsula, denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula. This is a very important topic for cooperation between Washington and Beijing. And also not just the President Biden, but also the Asia visit by the State Secretary as well as the Defense Secretary. They all emphasize the importance of cooperation between the US and China. But unfortunately, I actually agree with Professor Scobell that it's very difficult to see any kind of visible progress in cooperation between the two rivals. So the Asia, we cannot really decouple the situation, global situation and the Asia-Pacific. But still, I believe that there is a glimpse of hope and optimism. And I think that this is something that we have to do to have a better future. Of course, in reality, the nature of the tension between the two countries remain unchanged, and also the denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula. This is a priority for South and North Korea as well as all the relevant countries. And they all have the same goal. And also regarding the global denuclearization, yes, we have a lot of instability, including Pakistan and Afghanistan. And so in this condition, I think that still there can be some room for cooperation for denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula. And it's emphasized previously. So the nuclear the technological issues, and also the cooperation with neighboring countries. I think and the importance of cooperation will continue to exist despite the rivalry between the US and China. Of course, things will be difficult, but maintaining and keep the channel of dialogue and communications open, I think that will could offer and brighten the future.
Thank you very much. Both of the professors explained so well that we can understand that the denuclearization issues of North Korea might be dependent by the relations of the major superpowers to a certain degree. Having said that, this aggravated confrontation between the US and China in this kind of circumstances, as Professor Kimiya briefly mentioned before, China would like to use North Korea as a buffer more and more. At the same time, North Korea, on the other hand, we want to go through China to give oppression to South Korea and the US. That's one kind of scenario that we can expect in the future. That's number one. And number two is, as indicated by Professor Kimiya, that in itself will make North Korea very proactive. On the other hand, in other words, North Korea on the one hand wants to have the intervention in China, and at the same time, North Korea can have some kind of overture to the U.S. as well. So, with these two scenarios, what would Professor Park think? After hearing Professor Park, I'd like to ask Professor Kimia to add up what Professor says, please. Yes, thank you. The North Korea might want to use China as we see it. As we see the bonding situation between North Korea and China, North Korea is more active in approaching China, and also they're both very favorable, but on the other hand is limited in terms of its approaches. So I believe that I do not think that North Korea will be proactive because of China, as I believe, and as I mentioned before, from the perspective of North Korea, they have to use the rivalry between China and the U.S. in order to maximize their interest. So, in a sense, this is quite well known in the past as a kind of Cold War style diplomacy. I think it can be called as pendulum diplomacy. It's like just the pre-Cold War situation. So it is true that North Korea is a kind of burden for China as well. When they had the agreement in 1991, China didn't know of the actual situations in North Korea. China will remember that kind of mistakes. And also after the Korean Peninsula Peace Process started, for the first time, the U.S. and North Korean summit meeting have been started after the inauguration of Kim Jong-un. For the first time, Kim Jong-un also had a summit with the Xi Jinping before meeting with the U.S. So North Korea wants to use China to get something from the U.S. North Korea is not just bonding with China for the sake of China only. So I'd like to add one more thing. As Professor Lee mentioned, so the Chinese policy on North Korea has not been changed. However, for the last several months, this is kind of more visible in that China is advocating North Korea more visibly in the AIF meeting. Wang Yi, the Foreign Minister Wang Yi, also emphasized the importance of the situation, and also the lifting of the sanctions has been mentioned by China and the Chinese delegation. Even though North Korea doesn't say anything, so this dual track system and also parallel track approach has been very active in that regard. So they are just influencing the relationships in these areas. Thank you very much. However, then I would like to now listen from Professor Kimia. Thank you. As for me, as Professor Park mentioned, North Korea has been consistent in its approach from the Cold War era. I agree with him when he said that. North Korea has been always in the pendulum situation from the USSR and China. And North Korea might think that if they are just bonding with those China and superpowers, they will not have the future. They might think that. And also, North Korea has not been winning in the relationship with the U.S. yet, so they want to do something else in order to have a breakthrough. So I believe that North Korea has tried to have the negotiations and the talking with the U.S. and also after the Cold War, the nature of the Cold War in the North Korea is to have the negotiations with the U.S. so that they can have the guarantee of their own survival. Having said that, that kind of keynote has been maintained and remaining in North Korea, even though they had the keynote, that's only keynote, and also the U.S. will not respond to it. And also North Korea will want the support and help by China as well. So from the North Korean perspective, they cannot change abruptly, but although they cannot transform itself, there is a tendency for them to want to change. So what can we do, especially under the Moon Jae-in administration? So we have to have this momentum to change. So the biggest power should come from South Korea and South Korea only. because South Korea can persuade other neighboring countries like China and the US about why we have to utilize the keynote by the North Korea at the moment. How can we make it useful for the benefits of other neighboring countries? That is the only way to go. Thank you. Thank you very much. As I said, time is almost up. Do we have any audience to have a question? We could entertain maybe one question. If not, I don't see any hands, so that's it. Our session 1-3 was about the Korean Peninsula and the US-China strategic competition. We have dealt with what kind of perspective we can have on the Korean Peninsula from these geopolitical situations and relations. At this moment of time, we have other parallel sessions in 3 different tracks, and 2 tracks are quite similar to ours to deal with the Korean Peninsula's peace. The overall temperature will be a little bit nuanced because other panel will be talking about the Korean peace process to be reinitiated with the relations between the North and South Korea. They have been just putting out a lot of thoughts of wisdom. On the other hand, our track here in this 1-3 will go into the situation beyond South Korean Peninsula. We have been looking at what kind of the overall climate has been around Korean Peninsula. So our discussions have been very useful. So we concluded kind of that our future for the peace of the Korean Peninsula is not so bright. If that's the reality that we have to accept, what kind of strategies we have to fold in the future. So we've been talking about these things so far. Now, our given time is not long enough at all to deal with all these prominent scholars from 4 different countries, the US, China, Japan, and Korea. I'm very sorry that I was not able to give full time and I was not able to get the best of them or to get the most of their ideas. However, no, we were able to get some summaries and essence of their ideas. So Ministry of Unification will be listening to this session as well. So the East Asia Institute will also do our homework to make a summary out of this discussion. So we're going to publish the results of our discussions today. So that is my promise to you. And thank you very much. And this has been our session number 1. Thank you very much for participating.